Ron.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 16th event in the fall 2021, winter 2022 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbard and Carl Wilson. Our January 31st event with Danielle Smith and her forthcoming book, Shine Bright, A Personal History of Black Women in Pop, has been postponed and will be rescheduled in the coming months. But we will be back on February 7th with Dan Charnas, who will talk about Dilla Time, the life and afterlife of the hip hop producer who reinvented rhythm. And he will be in conversation with Kelly Louise Carter. Today, we're excited to have Phil Freeman and Jeff Schwartz here to talk about their respective book and book in progress, Ugly Beauty, Jazz in the 21st Century, and Free Jazz. Philip Freeman has written Ugly Beauty, Jazz in the 21st Century, a vital guide to the contemporary musical landscape, which will be published by Zero Books in January 2022. Freeman has been writing about jazz, metal, world music, and modern classical for 25 years. WBGO's Nat Chinen describes him as, quote, a free-thinking jazz critic, wary of majority opinion and allergic to conventional wisdom, unquote. And the New York Times' Giovanni Russinello has praised his, quote, thoughtful, ear-first, socially attuned music criticism, unquote. His work has been published in Downbeat, Jazziz, The Wise, Jazz Noir, the LA Times, The Village Voice, and on Stereo Gum, Bandcamp Daily, and many other sites. He is the co-founder of the independent arts and culture website, podcast, and record label Burning Ambulance, and his previous books include New York Is Now, The New Wave of Free Jazz, published by the Telegraph Company in 2001, Running the Voodoo Down, The Electric Music of Miles Davis, published by Backbeat in 2005, and the anthology Marooned, The Next Generation of Desert Island Discs from Da Capo Press in 2007. Ugly Beauty, which shares its title with the monthly column Freeman has been writing for Stereo Gum since 2017, consists of profiles and analyses of 43 musicians divided into 5 sections. As Freeman says in the book's introduction, quote, I encourage you to think of Ugly Beauty less as an encyclopedia and more as a collection of postcards. Jeff Schwartz is a bassist, public librarian, and activist in Los Angeles. He has performed in jazz, rock, contemporary, and canonical classical music, Arabic music, musical theater, and free improvisation, including the members of the AACM and the LAFMS. His PhD is in American Studies, and he has published in Popular Music Notes, he has published in Popular Music Notes, Kirkus Reviews, Postmodern Culture, American Music, and Critical Studies in Improvisation, as well as in A Basic Music Library and Free Jazz Communism. And he is presented at the POP Conference, the New Music Gathering, the Guelph Jazz Festival Symposium, the annual meetings of the California Library Association, the Music Library Association, with the Society for American Music, the International Society for Improvised Music, and other conferences. His first book, Free Jazz, A Research and Information Guide, appeared in Routledge's Music Bibliography series in 2018, while his second, also entitled Free Jazz, will launch SUNY Press's Introductions to Popular Music Genres series this October. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Carl will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Carl will find them there at the end of the discussion. And feel free to also post comments throughout the conversation. So now I'll turn things over to Phil and Jeff.
Great, okay. Thanks. So I'm gonna go first because my book kind of sets up Phil's. Phil, did you want to say something else first?
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
So, yeah, you know, it makes a little bit more sense historically and kind of, I think, in the way we're both thinking about the music. So my notes are headed, why another book on free jazz and why me? So SUNY put a call for contributions for this series up in the Jazz Studies Collective Facebook group, kind of spring 2020. And I waited a while to respond because you may remember there was a lot of talk about representation and inclusion and those sorts of things at that time. And I didn't want to immediately come in and take an opportunity that, you know, someone from an underrepresented group could use and that would benefit someone else's career. I I'm a public librarian. I'm coming to you from an office at the Santa Monica Public Library, not my office. And, you know, this, I don't get points for doing this at my job. But my job enables me to do this, right? So I waited until July, and then, you know, since no one else had claimed it, I grabbed the spot, and I guess I was the first one to finish, so mine will be the first one to come out. I know they have books in the pipeline on ragtime, and I think on Delta blues, and they are definitely looking for more contributors, not just, you know, jazz and blues, but, you know, any kind of popular music genre. I'm not sure the scope is even just the US, you know, so bring them anything. I know 33 1/3 is also doing a genre series. The folks at SUNY are pretty emphatic that theirs is going to be more serious, whatever that means. I assume that, you know, it's not, there's, you know, but if you want to pitch them an experimental book on, you know, witch house or hypnagogic pop or something like that, why not? Anyway, enough preambling. So this book grows out of my dissertation, which was called New Black Music, which I wrote in 2003 for Bowling Green State. And that book was, or that project was, you know, very ambitious and kind of a big old mess. So please don't read it. And out of the process of trying to sell it, Routledge invited me to do the free jazz book for their music bibliographies series. And you can see about the first 50 pages of that on Google Books, which includes a short introduction and a couple of hundred entries. There's over 2,500 entries annotated. That took about 18 months. It was a lot of fun. So this made this a great kind of COVID project because I'd already done all the research, right? And then some. So I could just take the time, you know, that I was not out there playing gigs and restructure this stuff into what's hopefully a more, you know, coherent and accessible form. Also, you know, between 2003 and now, I did a lot of playing, and I kind of highlighted that in my bio because that is, I think, one of my sources of authority, right? Is that I've gotten to see those Henry Threadgill charts that we were talking about before the formal recording started. You know, I got to play with Adelio Smith's music in a workshop at UCLA with him. You know, it's an ongoing controversy about whether people have to be musicians or, you know, be able to read and write music or whatever to write about it in an authoritative way. And, you know, obviously the answer to that is no. I have no idea if, you know, Grail Marcus can read music, but I will read everything that he writes, right? Same thing, you know, for, you know, Amiri Baraka. We can think of dozens of examples of our favorite music writers, I'm sure. But if you think about other art forms, I think there's a level of kind of familiarity with the techniques and processes of film or painting or literature, which is not that common in music writing. So I'm like, okay, I can bring this. At the same time, you know, when I was doing my dissertation and afterwards, definitely noticed that the people who do technical analysis of popular music and jazz often are not interested in doing anything except technical analysis. There are a ton of jazz theses which are like, here's a catalog of 2-5-1 patterns that Clifford Brown plays, which is super useful if you want to learn to play trumpet like Clifford Brown, or figure out your own ways to get around those chord changes. But, you know, there's a universe outside as well. So I'm going on a little long, I guess. Besides playing during the last few years, I ran a concert series at my library for about 5 years called Soundwaves, soundwavesnewmusic.com, presenting, all sorts of flavors of non-commercial music tied to the DRAM streaming service from New Worlds Records. So some of the big names I had are like Wayne Horvitz and Elliott Sharp, Vicky Ray, Bobby Bradford. Played on the series with my friends Dana Reason and Andrea Centazzo. So, and then also during the last couple of years, sort of also as a COVID project, I think I've become a lot more politically active. I'm currently president of the Culver City Democratic Club and a member of the city's General Plan Advisory Committee, which seems kind of marginal, except that there's, I think, a strong influence between, urban planning and culture, looking at the development of, organizations like the AACM or the Union of God's Artists in Music Ascension, which is Horace Tapscott's collective, or the Black Artist Group in St. Louis, or the Loft Jazz phenomenon in New York, or the development of nonprofit funding thing for culture, either government and foundation support, like in Will Robbins' book and Amy Beale's books. There's so to be able to think about it as from the performer side and the policy side and the presenter side. So trying to bring all this stuff together. I also, I have one visual aid, which I will share with you now. I made a table of the 3 major surveys of free jazz and then added my own. These are the chapters. I must confess that I made this after I wrote my book. It probably would have made my life easier had I made it before I wrote my book, and I color coded it to show the kind of continuities between John Littweiler's The Freedom Principle, Val Wilmer's As Serious as Your Life, and Eckhard Yost's Free Jazz. And I'm, mildly disappointed to be recycling a title, but honored to share it with him. So, looking at these, I'm like, I cannot do another list of great artists and albums. So I came up with this idea to organize it thematically around these 5 concepts of freedom, spirituality, energy, experimentalism, and self-determination. I think, I listened to Khalifa Sene's talk on this series and heard him on a couple of other podcasts, but I haven't actually read his book yet. But I think, many artists have kind of a fraught relationship to genre, but free jazz especially so. There are, nobody likes it. Even Ornette Coleman said that, he hated it and that the record company named that record Free Jazz, and he never meant it to be, the name of a genre. But I found it useful. Mary Baraka says in one of the essays, I think in the book called The Music, that the free in free jazz is a verb. So I'm like, that's good. So what is being freed, and what is the nature of this freedom? And then what are you free to do? Joe Morris' book says there's freedom to and freedom from, which obviously he did not make up. I think, I'm not sure what philosopher that goes back to, maybe Martin Buber, don't hold me to that. So freedom, right? So freedom from song form was the primary thing, the construction of alternatives to song form. And musicologists probably have more specific ideas about song form. For me, I'm talking about repeating harmonic cycles, whether we're talking about 12-bar blues or 32-bar show tune or some, original thing along those lines like Horace Silver or Duke Ellington might have written. But this idea that of jazz improvisation being based on cyclic harmony. And this really unites jazz as a common practice from the first recordings up until around 1959. And it's really provocative to me to think that in 1959, you could go out and see artists representing the entire history of the music from, Louis Armstrong to, Booker Little, and they were, or John Coltrane, and they were all playing on these harmonic cycles. There's an amazing story about Henry Grimes. I think it was at the 58 or 59 Newport Jazz Festival. He played with like 8 different bands, from like Benny Goodman to Thelonious Monk to Lee Konitz. And I mean, Henry Grimes was a brilliant bass player, but more importantly, all of these bands, all of these artists played on these cyclic harmonies, and he could play very similar walking bass lines for all of them, and it would work. So then this breaks, and I don't really subscribe to like a kind of great man theory of history, but there's a lot of forces, and I map out some of them, but ultimately Ornette Coleman is the break. Because for him, it's not an experiment, it's the whole thing that he does. So my first chapter, which I called Freedom, is trying to like sort out what it is that Ornette breaks on those first records, the Atlantic records. And I think what makes them so challenging is Paul Bley talked about the pieces having a different premise, not just that they were different sets of harmonies, but that they were different approaches to structure. So some of the time they're playing what people call an empty form, where it's still like a 12-bar, 3-phrase blues, but it doesn't have any particular chords. Other times they would play that with like elastic phrase lengths. So the harmony is there, but it's not 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars. It's however long Ornette wants to play each phrase. And then sometimes they just go, what people call time no changes playing, where they're swinging, but there's no particular harmonies. Everyone's following their ears. So once that form is sort of broken, the question is, well, why even have a form? Just if it doesn't dictate harmony or control harmony, if you can put anything into the space and the space can be elastic, then you're free. There's no law. I should say also that one of the reviewers from my press, the notorious reviewer number 2, said they thought these themes were corny. And they are cliches, but things become cliches because they have some explanatory power usually. Hopefully they also have some accuracy. But part of my response to this question of these things being sort of tired is to push them to their limits. So in the case of the Freedom chapter, it ends with around 65, 66, Ornette starts playing the trumpet and the violin, which he has no training to speak. He just figures them out in a way that makes sense to him. And he starts using his son on drums, who was, I think, 8 years old when they started playing together. They made an album called The Empty Foxhole, where he's 10. And again, Buddy Rich was playing drums in vaudeville when he was 10, but this ain't like that. So definitely a question of pushing the meaning of freedom and form. I'll try to go through the rest of these, relatively quickly. Also, there'll be a reason for you to buy the book to see how they'll work out. Spirituality, you have John Coltrane in the early part of the 60s, bringing exoticism, politics, and religion into his music. Think about compositions like African India, or Alabama, or spiritual. And of course, the climax of all of this is a Love Supreme, which is an example of music as prayer. And then also the kind of controversial album Om, which I think goes beyond music as prayer to be music as a ritual, that the musicians, beyond trying to sort of express an idea, are trying to alter their consciousness through music, the music as a ritual or meditation. This leads music outside of the music business. There's a Church of John Coltrane in San Francisco. He didn't actively participate in it was not his idea, but people were inspired by his music to literally make it the subject of a liturgy. And of course, Alice Coltrane, I see her on your shirt, Phil, dropped out of music in the mid-70s to become a full-time spiritual leader. And then exoticism runs through this spirituality as well. And in the cultural context of the 1960s, of course, that harmonizes with the spiritual interest of the Beats and hippies. Anyway, there's a lot more I could say about this. I wrote 160 pages about it, so hopefully there's more to say about it. I'll wrap up by talking about my very last chapter, which I called Ancient to the Future, which is part of the motto of the AACM, the Great Chicago Musicians Collective. And I talk about two pieces of music in particular. One, Roscoe Mitchell's Jackson in Your House, which is recorded by the Art Ensemble of Chicago in 1969. And the other, not an AACM artist, but from Black Artist Group, Julius Hemphill's Dogon AD. In the music of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, free jazz encompasses the entire history of music. They play jazz, they play reggae, they play completely improvised music, they play hand drum ensembles, they play variations on the theme of Monteverdi on the album La Stanza Sophie. So that's one way in which free jazz persists, is by becoming a kind of meta music, which anything, and this is not exclusive to the Art Ensemble. If you think about the music of the Instant Composers Pool or Don Cherry, or some of the records that Archie Shepp made, like The Crowd My People and Attica Blues, that freedom becomes the freedom to do absolutely anything under this banner. Performance art, things incorporating dance, etc. On the other hand, Dogon AD has what really intrigued me about that song, which is a sort of strange, funky song in 11, is that there have been a ton of cover versions recently. Vijay Iyer did one. The band Broken Shadows with Tim Byrne and Chris Speed did one. I think I found like a dozen. And to me, this is an alternative kind of version of the historiography of free jazz, where it becomes part of a new common practice, instead of become that it doesn't annihilate, song form as people might have thought in the mid-60s, but all of these possibilities, these sort of structural possibilities that somebody like Anthony Braxton or Cecil Taylor creates, as well as these anti-structural, completely improvised performances of someone like Evan Parker, or performances that create their own structure as they go through various kinds of spontaneous harmonic references, like Sam Rivers' trio of the 70s. That these are all options. They're all part of an expanded common practice in jazz, along with elements from popular music and world music, etc. so there's two, so that's sort of my conclusion, is that by, over the course of the past few decades, there's a vision of free jazz where it potentially encompasses absolutely anything, and another where it becomes part of a new common language in jazz, which I think is a good place to hand off to Phil, because his book seems to me to pick up that thread about 30 years later and say, what are some of these new strains? I do want to throw one other thing into the mix, though, before I finally shut up, which is that as well as a challenge to song form, I think free jazz is a challenge to jazz's status in the music industry, that it's sort of in between popular music and art music. And we can't really say that Giant Steps was, pop music in the same way that, Doris Day was, but there's a kind of structural relationship in terms of the labels, in terms of the venues, in terms of the shared material. And that breaks down when you have artists who are insisting on making their own systems. They're freed, they're in a way constructing an analog to the experimental music of somebody like John Cage or Stockhausen, who were definitely reference points for the AACM. And that's what talking about Will Robin and Amy Beale's books and the development of kind of a high art government and foundation infrastructure in the post-war period in the US, and then the challenges to it from free jazz. And I talk a lot about George Lewis in the book, because George was the first Black curator at the Kitchen, which was a real center for downtown kind of white experimental scene. I hate to call it a white experimental scene, but y'all know what I mean. George was also a MacArthur genius. If you look at these sorts of high art markers like the Pulitzer and the MacArthur, like when they start giving them MacArthur grants, the first musicians who get them are these uptown composers, people sort of in the school of like Milton Babbitt, people who are in the tradition of a very kind of formal avant-garde, not the downtown conceptual people like, Cage or Lamont Young or somebody, but, people who have a kind of mathematical and scientific approach to avant-garde music. And then after a few years, it's all, Cecil Taylor, Steve Lacy, Anthony Braxton, Mary Halverson, Tyshawn Sorey. So to me, it's interesting, and I would love for someone to write a whole book about this. George Lewis did a lot of work on this in A Power Stronger Than Itself, but there's a lot more to tell, I think, that free jazz kind of ran what, activists call an inside-outside strategy, both creating their own cultural institutions and demanding a piece of the ones that exist. So I've probably taken more time than I'm supposed to, and hopefully I've given y'all a lot to chew on, but not enough that you won't buy this book in October. Phil?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a few things that you said that I think are very interesting. One is because I'm actually planning on bringing up Lewis in a minute, even though it's not, my book doesn't deal that much with the avant-garde, but I do a certain amount of that. But the other thing that reminded me was, your mention of the way jazz used to sort of interface with mainstream culture more. A couple of weeks ago on January 6th, because I just pulled up the tweet, I said, today's head explodey realization, John Coltrane's version of My Favorite Things was released 4 years before the movie The Sound of Music. because he was actually dealing with it as a Broadway theme. It came out less than a year after the Sound of Music opened on Broadway. And I mean, to me, existing in 2022, that's all the past. It's all kind of a blur. And I didn't really put the timeline together when I first heard, my favorite things. It was like, oh, it's just from back then. And I didn't even realize that The Sound of Music, the movie, didn't even come out until 1965. So, but anyway, my book. My book is called Ugly Beauty, Jazz in the 21st Century. It's named for my Stereo Gum column, which I've been writing since 2017. And that in turn is named after a Thelonious Monk composition, which was the only composition that he wrote in waltz time. Basically, as Kimberly said in the introduction, because it's what I said in the introduction to the book, it's not meant to be encyclopedic. It's not meant to include everyone who's doing interesting things in jazz in the 21st century. It's primarily musicians under the age of 45, and it's mostly structured around personal encounters. So, I mean, a reviewer described it as criticism mixed with memoir, which was not really my intention, but sort of sneakily was. I started out at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, wanting to write a book that was much more amorphous and exploratory, kind of in the vein of things that David Toop had done, like Ocean of Sound and Haunted Weather, books where he kind of collages a bunch of sound-related experiences that he's had and turns them into a narrative. And I realized that after struggling with it in a Scrivener document for a few months, I realized that I'm not that kind of a writer, and I'm not that kind of a thinker. I'm fundamentally a journalist. And so what I did was I said, okay, if I do this in a traditional journalistic style, what's it going to be? And then I said, all right, for the last 5 years or so, roughly since 2015, I feel like jazz has been on a creative and cultural hot streak. Basically, the dividing line is the release of Kamasi Washington's album, The Epic, which garnered a much larger mainstream audience than any jazz release before that, and brought a whole bunch of people into the tent. I mean, I remember going to see Kamasi perform at the Blue Note in New York, which holds less than 150 people, but the whole crowd was, or almost the entire crowd was, people substantially younger than me, in their in their late 20s to mid 30s. And a lot of them, because it's a small, tight space, I could overhear conversations. And a lot of the people there were discussing with their dates how one was supposed to act in a jazz club. They didn't know the social rules. They had never been there before. And so they were it was almost a form of adulting for them to have come out to a jazz show. And so it was very interesting to me. And I said, there's a story there, because that was, mid to late 2015. In 2018, I think it was, I went and I saw Kamasi again. And this time he was playing Forest Hills Stadium in Queens. And it's an outdoor stadium. And he was opening for Alt J, but I mean, there was a huge crowd. We're talking like easily a couple thousand people on the ground, to see a straight up jazz show. And so that was my jumping off point. And then what I did was like Jeff, I kind of organized the 5 sections of my book under themes. The first section deals with traditionalists, which are they're performers who I describe as, you could play their music for anybody and that person would say, yes, that's jazz. It sounds like 1960. It sounds, they're doing interesting things. It's not boring music, but you could play them for anybody and they would be like, yeah, that's a jazz record. I get that, And then the second section is people who are more experimental or who are kind of pushing forward and pushing at the boundaries of composition and structure and methodology, and really force you to ask the question, is this jazz? Like, for example, one of the people that I deal with in that section is Vijay Iyer, who puts himself in the piano lineage of classic jazz. He talks about how much he was inspired by McCoy Tyner and all these other players, but he also writes string quartets. He writes experimental electronic pieces. He does, all sorts of things. And so if a jazz musician, self-described or otherwise, writes a string quartet, is it still jazz or is it a string quartet? Are you a classical musician now doing this? Or if you write a completely scored piece that is scored for a jazz ensemble, trumpet, saxophone, piano, bass, and drums, but it's completely written out and everybody's playing off the page, is that jazz? Does the element of improvisation have to be there for it to count? And then the third section is sort of spiritual jazz in a way, but that's also the area where I put in a lot of musicians from outside the US, because the UK, the London scene, which I deal with in several chapters here, is extremely high energy and extremely potent right now. But it's also primarily, one of the key descriptions of it is that it's also very much driven by the children of immigrants. It's mostly Black and Latin musicians who, Shabaka Hutchings, for example, is the de facto leader of the London scene, and he is originally from Barbados. And then the other kind of breakout figure is saxophonist Nubia Garcia, who I believe is Guyanese. And, they have broken into what was a very white British jazz scene and have completely revitalized it by bringing in dance floor elements and, taking things from dub and Caribbean party music and turning it into jazz. But then in that same chapter, in that same section, I also have a chapter about a bunch of musicians from South Africa who really impressed the hell out of me. So, there's a really, really good South African jazz scene right now, which again has some of the superficial trappings of spiritual jazz in the Alice Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders kind of sense. But because they are coming at it from an African perspective, they're very different in terms of, the manifestations of the spirituality and stuff like that. I mean, Nduduzo Makathini is literally a healer in his community, and then also a music professor and a recording artist and all this other stuff. So, there are those things to contend with. And then the fourth section, I dealt with 5 different trumpeters, all of whom are doing very different things, but all of whom are under 40. And what was interesting to me about them was that if you're under 40 as a musician, you grew up in a world where hip hop was the air that you breathe and the water you swim in. And I am 50, and I remember a time before hip hop. I remember when there was no such thing. And then all of a sudden there was rap music, and so it was very interesting to me to have the conversation with these guys in particular, because I feel like the metaphoric parallel between a trumpeter and an MC is very clear. It's one guy, relatively small instrument, leading from the microphone, And so I wanted to talk to those guys about how hip hop influenced their music and how they related it to jazz. And they take very different approaches, but all of them agree that, it's in there. And the fifth and final section is what I called it for myself when I was putting the book together was the punks, which is they're people who take a DIY, anything goes kind of approach to sound, and so Jamie Branch considers herself a free jazz trumpet player, but comes out of the Chicago underground rock scene in a way. Matana Roberts is someone who travels between worlds. I mean, she does compositional stuff and does solo performances. I mean, I saw her do a solo performance at the Whitney Museum, but at the same time, she was a member of Greg Tate's group, Burnt Sugar, for several years, and she's done a million other things. And then in the final chapter, I talked to Moore Mother, who is, a noise musician and a poet, and who also fronts the free jazz group Irreversible Entanglements, who kind of remind me of the New York Art Quartet. And when I interviewed her, she explicitly said, or one of the group members, rather, I think it might have been Luke Stewart, the bass player, who's also in the book, explicitly said, our model was the New York Art Quartet working with Amiri Baraka. So it draws a direct line from 1964 to the present. But because there is a sort of first person aspect to the book, like virtually every chapter starts with a show that I went to or the circumstance under which I met the artists, or whatever. It kind of raises a lot of issues that I was sort of trying to wrestle with regarding the role of journalism and the role of criticism. For example, the very first chapter is about J.D. Allen, tenor saxophonist, very traditionalist, sounds like John Coltrane, sounds like Sonny Rollins, but doing his own thing. But I've been interacting with him for a decade. The first time I interviewed him was in 2011. I interviewed him again in 2016, and then had him on my podcast in 2018, and then profiled him in Downbeat in 2019. And after those 4 conversations, and after going to see him live a couple of times, he got in touch with me and asked me to write liner notes for his album that was coming out in 2020. And so part of the narrative of the first chapter of the book is me going to the recording studio to watch them make that record. And there are journalists and critics draw all kinds of ethical lines for themselves. Everybody draws their own borders, and so I agreed to write the liner notes because after interviewing him 4 times, I felt like JD was a guy I knew. We're not friends, but we know each other pretty well, and there are other musicians that I consider my actual friends, like Matt Shipp, I've known for 20 years. We talk about non-music related stuff. We have an actual connection. And so then the critic subject relationship becomes, a thing. And so, for example, I did write the liner notes for JD's album. And when I wanted to feature it in my Stereo Gum column, I got another writer to do it. I said, I'd really like you to write about this record, and I'll pay you a portion of what I get paid for the column, and you just write this one blurb, And so that was, something that was on my mind. And for example, there's another piece in here that really kind of got in my head in a way, which is a chapter on Mary Halverson, the guitarist, where I wrote a cover story on her for The Wire, which portions of that became her chapter in the book. And most of the time when I write pieces about an artist, a lot of the time it's a phoner. It's not an in-person encounter, but in that particular instance, I met her in person at a diner in Manhattan, and we talked for like 2 hours, and when I wrote the piece, I wanted that to be part of it, but I was walking a very fine line for myself because I wanted to describe our in-person interaction without it tipping over into the really gross kind of Vanity Fair style profile writing where you talk about the actress's hair and makeup and what she's eating and making it seem like it was a date rather than an interview. I was very, very skittish about that and very careful about not talking about her any differently than I would talk about a male artist, really trying to strike that balance. And so that was, that's something that I don't really think about that much, but it came up very strongly in that one. And so when I adapted the piece for the book, I was again very cognizant of, maintaining tone in that way. The other excerpt that I'd like to talk about briefly is one where I interviewed Tyshawn Sorey, and he is someone who has a MacArthur grant. He's a college professor at, I don't remember what school now, but he's bounced around from a few different schools. Yeah, he's at Penn. And he's a brilliant guy, but at the same time, he is also a dude from Newark who's got a really, really good sense of humor and, is a lot of fun to hang out with. So we were doing a kind of invisible jukebox piece for The Wire, which is their equivalent to Downbeat's blindfold tests. So I played him a bunch of records. We talked about the issues that they raised. And the big issue that we discussed in that conversation was the issue of improvisation versus composition and the general meaninglessness of that, boundary, that it really only matters to writers, that it doesn't necessarily matter to listeners, and that it's often bothersome to the artist to be asked about it. He said, the way he described it was, he said, people are always trying to find the seams in your stuff, to figure out where you stopped writing and started just making it up as you go along. And so that put me into a space where I am trying to put myself in the subject's shoes in a way and understand how it must feel to be asked the same questions every time you're interviewed, and also specific to jazz and to avant-garde jazz too. And this goes back to something that Jeff brought up, is there is a racial angle that implies that composition versus improvisation is a white versus black thing. I interviewed Anthony Braxton last year for my podcast, and he mentioned to me in his interview that he was often thought of as insufficiently black because of the type of music that he made. He wrote a piece for 100 tubas, and people would look at him and go, why would you do a thing like that? Why aren't you playing jazz quartet type of stuff? And in George Lewis's book, about the AACM, A Power Stronger Than Itself, when you read that, it really drives home the idea that the guys in the AACM were highly educated musicians making avant-garde art that was as intellectually rigorous as anything being done on any university campus. But when the Art Ensemble of Chicago went to Paris, where they wound up living for 2 years, critics wrote about them like they were these free jazz political radicals, not like they were people with complex theories about their art. And so those experiences have influenced my thinking as an interviewer to the point where now I'm trying to see things from my subject's point of view to get them to explain not only how they created a given piece of music, but how they think about their own music making and their role in the world as artists, and because there are perspectives that are simply unavailable to me. And so that's the reason I'm asking them the questions, is because I want to know what, I want to know why they think about their music the way they do, and how they came to this, how they came to their sense of self, and I think in the book, I get to that with certain artists and less so with others, but with a lot of players, I do definitely try and ask them about the communities they come from, in terms of, not just in terms of traditional sort of social positioning, but in the sense of like, did you grow up in a musical family? Stuff like that. Like, I remember I interviewed Shabaka Hutchings and Nubaya Garcia and trumpeter Yaz Ahmed all together in a room. And we discussed the fact that they are all the children of immigrants. And I said, it says something about British society that immigrant families would be perfectly fine with their children becoming jazz musicians, whereas in this country, the children of immigrants, their parents would likely be horrified at, the idea of their parents, of their kids, basically like throwing away any chance at financial security. It's that whole thing of coming to America for a better life. You can't do that over here, but over there, there's schools and, there's support for the arts. So it's much easier to kind of do that sort of thing. I'm open to questions at this point.
Yeah, we have some questions coming up in the chat, and I'd love people to indicate more. Just before we do that, I wondered if either of you have questions for each other that you want to start with. But if not, we can go to the crowd.
No, I think we should just let people ask us stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Ben, given you had sort of somewhere between a comment and a question about the UK scene, but maybe you can engage that with Phil. Ben, are you still there?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, that was just kind of a comment, but I could ask another question if you want. I mean, just I actually grew up and lived in England in the 80s and the early 90s, and there were tons of prominent Black British jazz musicians, not just Courtney Pine and the Jazz Warriors, Orphy Robinson, Julian Joseph, Paul Reed, great drummer Mark Mondesir. This is not a new thing, and you can go back much earlier to Joe Harriet, who was Jamaican immigrant back in the 50s. But anyway, my question, which I guess both of these great authors I'd be interested in hearing about, is just kind of this classifying individuals, but as like putting a stamp on a musician and saying this person belongs to this category, often a genre category. I remember reading somewhere where Terry Riley said that since he became known as a minimalist in the 60s, he said something like, I could write something that would sound like Beethoven and people would still call it minimalist. And some of the stuff he's done in the last 40 years doesn't minimalist at all. And you could ask that about, Phil Freeman was mentioning how, someone like Vijay Iyer, who, like many of the great jazz musicians, rejects that label, but, he's done string quartets and things like this, Jeff also is taught as a category of experimentalists. And of course, a lot of those people reject the jazz label. I mean, George Lewis is an obvious example of that. And also when Jeff was talking about how like somebody, well, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, who have this all-encompassing great Black music category, And I got the impression you were kind of saying that shows that you can kind of put all of that in the free jazz basket or something. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant, but it's like, so my question is, do you think, or have you thought about the problem of categorizing not styles so much as individuals by putting them, and then it's like anything they do, you have to relate somehow to X genre or whatever it might be.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I ran into that in my 2005 book on Miles Davis, where one of the things that I said was the problem is that a lot of jazz critics refuse to accept the idea that Miles Davis stopped playing jazz in 1968. And, after that was making electric funk rock music, but people continued to treat him as a jazz musician, and he did everything he could to break out of that bag. And I think, jazz, the word jazz is a marketing term, no different than the word rock or the word country, and they're as wide as, as you want them to be. I don't know how you get rid of genres. In a post-record store era, maybe you can, but I don't know. It's difficult to break people out of that mindset.
Yeah, I definitely thought about this a lot, and I am certainly not in my book saying this person's an experimentalist, this person's a spiritual jazz artist, but rather looking at these as kind of modes of different sets of alternatives to song form. So, to be really, reductive about it, something that we call spiritual jazz is probably just going to have like a couple of chords, a lot of percussion, a lot of fourths, a lot of pentatonic scales. So things like that. And some of it is not, but I think there is, the idea of the, I also really tried to avoid using the word postmodern in my books, but it does seem like a way to talk about the art ensemble and the concept of great black music, that when Lester Bowie plays a Spice Girls cover, that's great black music. But also when, Roscoe Mitchell plays, atonal circular breathing solo, that's also great black music. It is what they do. I also really tried really hard to not be the jazz police. And there are a couple of places where I'm like, at some point to stop swing jazz, but you get to decide that. Very specifically with, there's a thing that George Lewis does in A Power Stronger Than Itself, where he talks about jazz as a kind of one drop rule, not the reggae kind of one drop either, which is that having made jazz ever, if you're a black artist, you will always be judged as whether or not you are making jazz, and not whether you're making jazz, but whether you are succeeding at making jazz. So it's just sort of double bind, where it's like, we know what jazz is, you're making jazz, and you're failing to do this thing. Mm-hmm. Rather than to say, now you're making something which is not jazz. But I'm just like, I'm not making that box. Next time I see Adam Rudolph, he will be mad that I put him in a book about free jazz, but I'll deal with that when it happens. Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you about Miles Davis, but but that's a different time. We can, I'll stop there, but there's obviously a lot more to say about this.
Thanks. Michael Barkley, I see your hand raised. Do you have a question?
I do. Thank you very much for these presentations. I am also 50 and relatively new to diving into jazz. So I'm curious about the generational thing that Phil talks about at the Commissary Washington show. Clearly his association with hip hop brought a lot of people into that. I got turned on to Sons of Kemet through for rhythmic reasons through funk, and I grew up listening to rock and R&B. So, but that's me. Like I'm middle-aged and I'm looking for new challenges in my listening. I'm really curious about those younger people. And as was mentioned in the chat, there was kind of like the acid jazz thing in the 90s. So maybe this is like a 20-year cycle or something where younger audiences are now interested in it. And I am curious about why, because I feel like as pop music gets increasingly mechanized and rock music becomes increasingly irrelevant for a bunch of reasons, I wonder if it is that spiritual connection of live improvisation, of people in a room together, of things that can only happen with human connection. I'm wondering if the bowling alone generation are looking for that connection that they find in jazz. I'm just wondering if you have any generational theories about why there's a new market for it now, and young musicians leading the way.
I mean, my thinking is I can't really analyze the audience, but I know that when I spoke to Nubia Garcia, she talked about the fact that, the one thing about the London scene of the moment is that they're all more or less peers, because the apprenticeship model where young musicians join the bands of older musicians, that's gone. There's no such thing anymore. So this is all people who know each other from music school and form bands together. It's very much a garage band ethos in that way. And she said, and I'm just paraphrasing, but she said, we all go to school together, we all live together, we're roommates, we live together, and we all go out to clubs together and we dance together. And then we go back to the rehearsal studio and we see no reason not to bring in elements of the stuff that we dance to when we're making our jazz records. So to them, it's very holistic. It's all one thing, it's social music. And and by the way, that's a whole other discussion, is the role of danceable jazz in the Black community versus jazz in the white critical community. I mean, I have only in recent years developed a real appreciation for jazz of the CTI Records, school, Grover Washington Jr. and Hank Crawford and people like that, who got little or no critical respect at the time, but sold a bunch of records to Black people. And it's a whole other perspective that needs to be taken into account, So I feel like that's probably what's going on, in a new way. I mean, you have people like a guy who I recently interviewed for Stereogum is Terrace Martin, who is a saxophonist and producer who makes jazz records, makes hip hop records, was the music director for Snoop Dogg's live band for like 3 years, starting in 2011, and is now part of Herbie Hancock's band. So it's all one world from their angle.
Thank you.
Great. Eric, you had a question.
Hey, let me unmute. Thanks for the really interesting talks about the books, which certainly dovetail in some directions. I was going to ask two questions, the latter of which you somewhat just were talking about. One was sort of the jazz version of tenured radicals. And, our previous discussion in this book series on a similar topic was author Anthony Reed, who teaches at Vanderbilt, being interviewed by Vijay Iyer, who teaches at Harvard, and just the general relationship of jazz, you can get tenure playing or thinking about as a category was going to be my first question for both of you in relationship to free jazz and jazz now. We can leave it there, but if you wanted to pick up on some of the previous question and talk about jazz that sounds good in cars as another category, I'm sort of interested in things that, like, maybe that's a little functionalist and a little crude, but as a non-jazz person who still listens to a certain amount of jazz, those are things my ears are telling me matter in the music, and I'm curious how you interpret them as forces. So jazz for tenure, jazz that sounds good in cars, if you feel like the second.
I mean, I'll just really briefly say that that's a huge gap in my own knowledge, because I know nothing at all about jazz radio, but I know that it's a huge force. I mean, I talk to label owners and they talk about how important it is to get something on WBGO or on some of the big, West Coast jazz stations, but I don't ever listen to the radio ever. So I have no idea, but I'll let Jeff talk about the tenure thing, because, I barely graduated high school. So.
Great. I want to shout out my friend Charles Sharp on this call, who has a history of working in LA jazz radio. And I don't think West Coast jazz radio is a thing. Is no KKGO, KJazz? Nah.
I mean, it is, but it isn't. I mean, KJazz, yeah, it's hard to say. So a lot of those channels are like KJazz are programmed not in California, right? And so they're canned for here. So yeah, the station in San Diego, there's one in San Francisco that's still, they actually have DJs who actually make choices about music. And I guess you could call them, I mean, my show, I make choices, but I don't only play California stuff.
Well, not just that, but your show, you'll also play Harry Parch.
Yeah.
And your show is on KXLU.
Right.
Which is the Loyola Marymount College station, which is also really pivotal in LA indie music. The cast of the Smells Like Teen Spirit video, for example, are all we're all KXLU people. But so I don't know. I don't talk to a lot of publicists, but I think they may be wrong about the radio business. I guess, I mean, I feel like Kamasi sells records because of journalism and because of being on, Bonnaroo and etc. But there may be a giant jazz radio thing that I just don't know about.
I wasn't, by the way, thinking of radio in the slightest when I asked the question. I literally was like talking about jazz that sounds good in cars, in the sense that so much jazz sounds awful at 70 miles an hour. And then there's a certain amount of jazz that sounds good at 70 miles an hour, including a lot of the British scene people you were talking about. So I was actually, for that part, which was my lesser question, because honestly, the tenure jazz was the big one. I was definitely curious, like, why to just think about jazz's relationship to car driving. So it could just as much be listening to a song off your CD or Spotify in the car as through a radio station. It's more about the connection between what does it take for music to not be some precious listening experience, but something that like works when you have your foot on the accelerator, for that part of the question.
Right. I kind of don't want you to be listening to Cecil Taylor when you're driving. I'll also say my car jazz experience really improved when I got a Prius. I could hear bass solos all of a sudden. But yeah, the more interesting part of this is the tenure jazz, the jazz school jazz and art school jazz. And this fits, I mean, again, would be an amazing thing for someone to write a whole book about. I know there are books about kind of the earlier stages of jazz education, which are kind of rooted in the Stan Kenton universe. A lot of white big band players and summer camps and the Jamie Abersold records come out of that. And, this is my grossly simplified history of jazz education, right? There's a wave of people like Archie Shepp and Max Roach who kind of get jobs in African-American studies departments coming out of the Black Arts movement. And somebody like Bill Dixon.
I was going to say.
And those people almost have this they're sort of like kind of have this artist in residence status more than like going through the universe of, the academic lives that many of us have. And I feel like it's been a very recent phenomenon, like with Corinne Gabbard's books. He did those 2 anthologies about 20 years ago. And the New Jazz Studies, where you did have people kind of starting to do cultural studies work on jazz. And a lot of those people are, really high-level performers as well as academics. Think about, well, of course, George Lewis, and then many of his students like Dana Reason and Jason Robinson. Some of Braxton's students, Mike Heffley, who I think was he at Wesleyan? Yeah. There's
Mary Alberson studied with Braxton for years.
But she didn't write a book. That's what I'm thinking about, right?
Yeah.
I kind of want to poke at this idea of artists versus academics, right? Because artists need food and, prefer to sleep indoors. And so that, and if you can make a living teaching about your work instead of teaching a million sections of freshman comp or group piano or something like that, then that's even better, right? So
has it flipped, I guess, is my question. Like, have we gone from a situation where the writer of jazz about jazz was more likely to be a college professor, a la, the classic 50s people, where now the performer is more likely to have received the MacArthur and teach at a prestigious university, and the person writing about jazz is scuffling more?
I mean, I can only speak for myself and say that I definitely have always felt like an outsider in the world of jazz criticism, and part of that comes from being, an uneducated knuckle walker, who came in from the world of metal, but yeah, it's I don't, if I had a graduate degree, would I still be doing this? I don't know,
Well, people were really mad at Vijay Iyer for getting his MacArthur, you may recall, because he hadn't kind of proved himself as a mainstream player. And that seemed like sort of I don't know what to say about this. I mean, for a while, I kind of like this idea of like jazz school jazz and art school jazz. That like jazz school is where you go to Berkeley and learn to play giant steps in all keys at 400 beats per minute. And art school jazz, our friend Vinny Golia complains about his CalArts students coming in as good saxophone players and leaving as bad performance artists.
I just want to throw in one little trivia point about Vijay, because who I like, he's an awesome guy, and I like a lot of his music, but it's very interesting that, despite his having come from a non-mainstream, academic world or whatever, if you go back through the Pitchfork archives, for years, he was the only jazz artist who, every time he put a record out, they reviewed it. Right. Every single one, for like throughout the 2000s. It was pretty fascinating to look and see like a dozen reviews by different critics.
That was going to be my, that was going to be
on the list.
That was going to be my punchline as a non-jazz person who does read Pitchfork, is that tenured jazz players and people whose records sound good in cars seem to be the two kinds of jazz that I see reviewed in Pitchfork on a regular basis.
Mhm,
All right,
mhm.
I'll shut up, but thank you.
I have maybe a final question, just to sort of tie together the sort of periodizing that these two books do. I guess what I'm thinking is that, in many ways, one could, from a like 1,000-yard stare perspective, say that free jazz is what emerged when jazz was eclipsed as the dominant commercial music in popular music, and this new kind of art jazz was partly a reaction to that displacement and partly a way of being in dialogue with that cultural position. And fights over that status kind of went on for the next 30, 40 years. But I feel like the scene that Phil's dealing with is something after that. And that this idea, and it's partly allowing dance music back into the music through the London scene in particular, but also a lot of experiments over the past 20 years, beginning with the sort of hip hop experiments in the late 90s and that kind of thing. So just in terms of the development of the music and where we're at in terms of the conversations and debates that are going on, have we transcended the jazz is dead arguments that went on through so much of the late 20th century and moved into something totally different?
I think so. I mean, I do want to say about avant-garde stuff in general is that while there are some avant-garde performers in my book, I kind of wanted to not focus on them. Like I included a few. I included James Brandon Lewis. I included the people from Irreversible Entanglements. I included, Jamie Branch and people like that. But I didn't want a whole section on people who speak the free jazz language, which is definitely a language and is definitely in practice. There are people out there who speak the language of late Coltrane and speak the language of Archie Shepp and Albert Eiler, right now in the modern world. But I wanted to not necessarily get bogged down in taxonomy by including a whole section that way. I just kind of sprinkled them in with everybody else. And I think that is the way I see the music right now, is as kind of a mosaic rather than a collection of camps throwing things back and forth. I definitely see everybody as on more or less an equal playing field because there's no money for anyone, and so you might as well get along.
I endorse that conclusion. I am a little bit skeptical to say that there's the free jazz language, just because I feel like it's like saying there's a 20th century composition language, right? I mean, there's Xenakis and there's Feldman and there's Parch, It's more like there's been this rupture and now, Tower of Babel situation. But I definitely agree that, and this may be too, I hope we don't stop here because this is too depressing, but I think that, there's no more jazz is dead because live music is dead. Before, I mean, there is simply no way that live music is viable in LA or New York in terms of being able to pay the rent on a venue or pay the rent by playing live music. That what changed is not so much that like rock and R&B replaced jazz at popular music, but that there's musician meme that goes around every few months of like, 20 years ago, a gig paid $50 and my rent was $500. Now a gig pays $50 and my rent is $3,000. And that it's simply not possible to live, that you know, the Village Vanguard has exactly the same number of seats now that it did in 1961, right? But living in Manhattan costs 10 times, right? So, you know, I want to say that the sort of, you know, it's over determined. And also we haven't talked enough about the Black arts movement, right? That all of this sort of challenges to the relationship of jazz to, or African-American creative music to popular music and the music industry. Like some of those breaks are intentional. Are people like Bill Dixon saying, you know, we're going to withdraw our music from the market and, you know, reintroduce it on our own terms. Or, you know, someone like Cecil Taylor being completely uncompromising about the presentation. You know, he's not going to play a 40-minute set and 20-minute break and come back, or, you know, take breaks so people can order drinks, or, you know, play anything except exactly what he wanted to.
Yeah, he it's funny because he told me when I interviewed him that he had been offered something like $100,000 to record an album of Gershwin compositions, and he walked away, you know.
Well, he did half a record of Cole Porter compositions, and those are pretty great.
Yeah, but
that was in 1958.
Exactly. This was when he was already himself, and he was like, no, the hell with that, you know. I do, by the way, we've been talking a lot about George Lewis, but there's another book that I would like to recommend to everyone watching, which is Benjamin Looker's Point from Which Creation Begins, The Black Artists Group of St. Louis. It's a tremendous book published in about 2003. And I feel like the Black Artists Group does not get enough recognition because they're overshadowed by the AACM. But since we're having this conversation on Julius Hemphill's birthday anniversary, I gotta recommend that book because it's incredible. So
that's maybe a great note to wrap up on. Authors reaching out to other great books for people to follow up. So I just want to thank Phil and Jeff and remind everybody that there's no session next week, but we'll be back the following week, the following Monday, February 7th, with Dan Charnas talking about Jay Dilla.